Welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. With us are Anne Ashworth, assistant editor at The Times, and Tom Chivers, assistant comment editor at the Daily Telegraph. Refreshed from that old bag of crisps I promised them earlier. Let's start with the front pages then. The Express, which has news of what they say is another big storm set to batter Britain with winds of 100 miles an hour. The Telegraph reports on Ian Duncan Smith's announcement that immigrants whose English isn't good enough could lose their benefits. The Mirror splashes with the Queen's apparent reaction to having her Bombay mix nicked, a revelation from the phone hacking trial. The Guardian carries the calls for a new food crime police force in the wake of the horse meat scandal. The Daily Mail highlights 3 critical reports into parts of the NHS under the headline National Health Shambles. The Times says welfare cheats are getting round attempts to crack down on fraud. And The Independent leads on the MP's pay rise below an aerial picture of South Africans queuing to pay their respects to Nelson Mandela. And we'll begin with that strength of linguistic skills that people might need, according to Ian Duncan Smith, if they want to come here and possibly claim benefits. Here it is on the Eye. Immigrants told speak English or lose your benefits. It appears then that a rather tougher test is going to be introduced as early as next week.
There are either 100 or 200 secret questions that are going to be posed for anybody a migrant who tries to claim benefits. Now, we don't know whether that's going to be a written test or whether the person in the job centre will ask these questions, and on that, your eligibility for benefits will be decided. And it seems to be that you need to be able to speak English well enough to be able to get a job. What level of English would be required, I'm not quite sure.
No, I mean, you wonder what sort of questions they'll be asking. I mean, it seems to me that, as we were saying earlier, there's no shortage of jobs for migrants that don't require that good English, and it seems a very odd decision, to me at least. But also, I mean, more importantly, it's going to be illegal. This clampdown. I mean, it says in the piece, it says that some EU diplomats saying, "I hope Duncan Smith has good lawyers," because this is, I think, a straightforward restriction on freedom of movement.
Let's just look at that then, because it's on the Daily Telegraph as well. It's a similar sort of headline, isn't it? Speak English or lose benefits. Because the agreement within the EU isn't you can travel across borders and look for a job if you speak, language adequately.
And lots of people disagree with that. Lots of people want that to be changed, but that's where you start, as you start changing the relationship with the EU and the European courts, not by saying, well, we're going to strip back these rights and then have a court fight, which you'll definitely lose.
The Telegraph also makes the interesting point. What about the numbers of people who settle in Spain who have no English? Could Spain, who have no Spanish, could Spain retaliate and say, you can't speak fluent enough Spanish, you can't have medical treatment, you can't claim any benefits?
But the newspaper article in the Telegraph says that the Conservatives are aware that success in deterring benefits tourists is going to be important to them come the election.
Well, of course it will, and that's what this is all about, is about looking tough, and you can see why, and I'm sure it's good politics, although it's been interesting that they've trotted out poor Ian Duncan Smith to do it so shortly after his universal credit shambles. You'd think he's probably had enough on his plate recently, but I suppose he's already full of bullets.
It's extraordinary how welfare benefits, the whole issue has just risen to the top of the agenda. It's the main theme running throughout all the front pages tonight. Whether the cuts to welfare, limiting benefits, tourism, and as to whether the effect, and if any curbs are actually effective.
Let's look at another story on the Telegraph before we move on to another one of those benefit stories that you mentioned, Anne, on the Times. This is the photo story here on the Telegraph. This is Thamsanqa Janchi, who was meant to be signing during the memorial service to Nelson Mandela earlier this week. He insists that he is a genuine interpreter, but a lot of people who need sign language said that they couldn't make out what he was saying, but maybe he was signing in English and that's not his competency.
This was the claim. I think he's now saying that he was actually having a full-on psychotic episode of some description during the thing and was therefore just waving his arms around essentially at random, I think.
But I mean that he managed to sign any particular words.
I know, but it all sounds very deeply odd. The trouble is, it's in a way, it's a very sad and strange story, but also I can't help but find it slightly funny, and I know I shouldn't, but
is he just a Walter Mitty who somehow has found himself amongst these people? I actually find it quite sad, because this is this great memorial for the great Mandela. Premiers take selfies, and we have a man signing whom the audience can't understand.
Yeah.
It's really rather sad.
And he was only a few feet away from Barack Obama.
Yeah.
So
security failings or security flaws, at
I
least.
think there's security failing in a big way.
Yes, exactly.
Let's go back to that benefits theme that you mentioned. Not the same story here on the Times. Cheats beat crackdown on benefit claim fraud. This is officials failing to prosecute the majority of people who are claiming benefits when they shouldn't be. Fewer than a quarter, it says, were prosecuted for flouting the welfare system last year. We are expecting the CPS to take a tougher stance on this. They said so in September, but I suppose that takes a while to filter through to the courts.
Well, when you see the size of the fine that you're likely to pay, which is about £500 to £2,000, you could see why people might be tempted just to go into fraud, thinking that the actual punishment would not be that great, given it seems up until now you've been able to avoid going.
Yeah, I suppose you think I like those odds.
Yes, I mean, they like the odds.
Yeah. The thing is, and I was banging on about this before, but it is also, it should be borne in mind that this is another looking tough thing rather than a actually trying to bring down the deficit thing, I think, because we're talking about 1.2 billion cost from benefit fraud. I quickly looked up on my phone the total Department for Work and Pensions bill while we were between things, and I think it was 167 billion pounds. So this is not quite a drop in the ocean, but it's not much bigger than that.
But it may not bring the deficit down particularly, but it sends a powerful message that the politicians are taking it seriously. And don't hard-working people want to see that? There's a principle
sure they do.
here.
Yeah. I'm sure people do want to see that, but I'm a little bit loath of things that are sending messages. If you're sending messages that no one's getting, I don't really see what the point is.
Let's move on and look at the Guardian then. Another benefits story. This time, Osborne to cut billions more from welfare. A fresh attack on the welfare budget is how The Guardian writes it, being announced by George Osborne today, telling MPs that he'd prefer to cut state benefits than slash the size of the state to its smallest since the 1940s. Have we seen this coming? I mean, we've seen what he's done so far.
There wasn't that much of this in last week's autumn statement, and it seems he's been saving this up to go in front of the Treasury Select Committee to say, look, I am going to get tough on welfare. Evidently, he thinks that plays very well with the electorate, because we are now, when they're gearing up to the election, and for an awful lot of people, they want to see the benefits bill.
Yeah. You're absolutely right.
How it's done, why it's done, who might be affected by it is less important than it being cut. And I think politicians of all parties know this.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I mean, you're absolutely right that welfare is the new black. Welfare is a few weeks ago when we were last on this show, and everyone was talking about cost of living. And it just seems that now the fashionable thing that every politician wants is a big welfare story.
But we have talked about welfare a lot during the coalition's time in office, haven't we? I mean, because lots of people at the very beginning were talking about how it smacked of ideological change, not just about addressing the deficit and the national debt. Have we now got to the point where the Conservatives in particular can't argue that it is an ideological change?
I don't know if anybody's arguing anything particularly effectively at the moment. It seems as if they're all floundering around trying to find ways to curb it, to seem tough yet caring. And the average person would think, well, it seems to me that, that it's still as easy to cheat the system as before. They won't be convinced that actual cuts have been made.
You're so right that they're all the parties seem to be floundering around, responding to each other's initiatives all the time, saying in this sort of desperate, like, oh, they've done that, so I need to do the same thing.
But when you've cut so much, there comes a point where aren't you running out of options of what you do next?
Well, I think I don't know. I think you can probably always keep cutting, and also, I mean, you can do things like that look like you're cutting without actually cutting sometimes, and so I think this sort of tough on government spending, we will bring your taxes down thing is always popular, and so I'm sure you can always find ways of making it look like you're doing it.
But it's not bringing people's taxes down, is it?
Not yet.
And this rhetoric gets a bit embarrassing when it becomes quite clear that you can cheat the system with a very, very low penalty for doing so.
What about this other line in this particular article? The Office for Budget Responsibility said that doing what George Osborne is talking about would leave day-to-day spending by government at its smallest share of national output, at least since modern records began in 1948. I mean, how popular will that be? I mean, people who are in work and struggling to make ends meet might think that that's a good idea, but if you're...
That's Britain pre the National Health Service,
Yes.
pre the beverage reforms. But then you might also argue that those reforms were brought in when we didn't live so long, that healthcare wasn't so expensive. And this is a huge argument that will just grow and grow over the next few months as the election
It is, and
approaches.
but I have to admit, from those of us who work in the news profession, who at least we're getting Tories who like small state money in the pocket of the taxpayer, and Labour who like equality and tax and spend, and it's like it should be, and it's like a proper football
It's nice and
match.
clear, you mean.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a red team and there's a blue team.
Exactly that.
They're
And
not
it's-
looking mauve because
Yeah.
they've sort of intermingled
No,
too much.
I mean, I'm sure it's still much more clustered around the centre than it was 50 years ago, or whatever. But it is much more fun to watch than it was when everyone was aping each other's, wearing each other's clothes all the time. And I think it's just nice to see. I think
The issue is, and you've raised this before, Tom, that when it comes to welfare spending, cut and cut and cut if that's what you choose to do. But there comes a point where you can't cut any further because you've got down to pensions, haven't you?
And then that's the third rail, they call it. That's what you can't touch that, or you're dead. You know, the pensions are the big thing that they account for most of the overall benefit spend, I think, and you can't really touch them because pensioners all vote, and young people don't.
Yes, and then we get into the engagement issue, don't we, which George Osborne is also interested in. So, and John Bercow, of course, trying to get us to do this online. Let's look at the Daily Mail. 3 more damning reports. I mean, you wonder whether there's anything more to report on with the NHS, really, because we seem to have several every week. National health shambles, says the Daily Mail, talking about mothers abandoned during labour, which would be terrifying if that's the case.
Yeah.
Serious hospital blunders every day. The article talks about one of these reports saying that some mistakes that are deemed so serious and should never happen are actually being made in hospitals 5 times a week. Patients losing faith in family doctors. It makes a great headline, but it's not the experience that a lot of people will have of the NHS.
Do you know,
is it?
that's exactly what I think. I wonder whether all these reports telling me that the public has totally lost confidence in the NHS reflects how people really feel. They might find all this worrying. They might be irritated that they can't get an appointment at their GP, but the average British person still has a huge amount of confidence in the NHS and its ability to save them and their children.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, I should declare an interest here and say that both my parents are doctors and work at the NHS, so obviously I'm a fan. But I do think that any number of these stories, there's just no getting around it. They're awful and appalling, and you wish they would never happen. But if you're dealing with one of the largest organisations in the world, and certainly in Europe, that sees millions of people, every week. Well, I don't have the stats at all, but you're going to, when he says there are 5 times a week serious mistakes happen that are so serious they should never happen. 5 times a week when you're probably seeing hundreds of thousands or millions of people a week it's awful, but it's not. It's going to happen. It's going to happen somewhere.
And also, we should also be relieved that there's obviously a huge amount of investigation as to what has been going wrong, and a commitment, we hope, to putting it right, to better standards.
Because there have been certain failings which were so troubling, mid-Staffordshire particularly, that there had to be investigations across many different sort of subject areas, didn't there? And it says here that the public confidence in the NHS is at record low. But I wonder how much worse hospitals, GP surgeries are now, or whether all of these problems may have always been there, but it's only because we've had these reports commissioned that we've discovered them.
If you remember last night, they said they were going to have spot checks on teachers who they felt were failing. Maybe what we need is more spot checks on GPs clinics, more spot checks on maternity units.
Yeah.
So these problems come to light earlier and are resolved.
The trouble is that sometimes we end up with, we're reporting on situations where we're sort of saying half of things are below average, the sort of mathematical mathematical certainty. That's because I mean a lot of it was death rates are worse than unnecessary deaths in some places. Well, it's an artifact of how you take statistics, and that's an unavoidable truth. So we do have to be careful when we say these places are in postcode lotteries and so on. Sometimes it's unavoidable. That's not all going to be perfect. It's not all going to be the same. But it's not to say we can't try and improve things.
Let's move on and look at the phone hacking case, which is currently making its way through the courts at the moment, and not the story that you necessarily have expected from that trial. This is the Queen. Here she is, looking resplendent in a pale pink hat. Hands off one's nuts, she's told the police, who were pinching her snacks. We understand from the Express, if we can have a little look at the Mirror as well, one is not amused. The Queen marked the bowls to show the levels of these snacks. She's got a rather savoury tooth. And she was cross that these coppers were helping themselves while they were in Buckingham Palace.
I love the Queen's hat, and I've decided I'm going to love her choice of snack. And
Bombay mix.
Yes, Bombay mix, but she looks very well on it, doesn't she?
Superfood, all those nuts, you see.
I'm already on record. I'm not a fan. It's just
she might have other things too. I do like this. It's just not quite what we were expecting to hear from the phone hacking scandal. I wonder if they've stopped pinching them.
Well, now they've been so. Well, it was 8 years ago. I suppose they've got new police in now, but maybe
it's amazing what we found out through the phone hacking trial, isn't it?
It's all been worth it.
Maybe she'll try it. She might have changed. Might not have Bombay mix anymore.
Wasabi peas now.
That's much more 2013, isn't it? That's the papers for tonight. Thank you to Tom Chivers and to Anne Ashworth for talking us through that rather mixed bag of papers tonight.